Hi, in this video, I'm going to implement the user role-based authorization with Next-Auth package in Next.js version 13. And also at the end of this video, I'm going to give you a practical example of how we can store the backend access tokens inside the Next-Auth sessions, and how to include them in the requests that are being sent to the backend APIs. So without further ado, let's get into it. This is the final form of application that we are going to work on today. As you can see, there are 3 pages in this application. Home page, which everyone can see it whether you are logged in or not. Admin panel, which only admin users can access this page, and also a user panel, which only normal users can access this. So if I go ahead and click on the user panel, I'm headed to the login page because I'm not logged in. So if I log in with the user 1, which is a normal user, and you can see that normal user now logged in, and if I click on the user panel, you can see that this time I can access to the user panel. And here in this page there is also a get user profile button which fetches the user profile data from the backend API. So if I click on this, you can see that the username of the user is user1, its name is normal user, and its role is user. Okay, now if I want to go to the admin panel, I'm again headed to the login page with this custom message which says that you're not authorized. So this time I'm going to log in with the admin user. You can see here the admin user is now logged in, and if I click on the admin panel again, now I can access to the admin panel page. If I click on the get user profile here, you can see the role of this user is admin. So in this way, when a user wants to do a specific action in our application, we can authorize them based on its role, whether it's admin or a normal user. And yeah, I think it's enough with the introduction, and let's implement this with Next.js version 13 and Next-Auth package. Okay, I open up my previous videos project, which is about the Next-Auth configuration and how to authenticate a user with username and password within the Next.js version 13 with the help of Next-Auth. So if I go to the pages folder and API, auth, and then open up the Next-Auth configuration file, you can see that in the authorize method, here we extract the username and password from the credential here and then send a post request to our backend API, which is on /auth/login, and then pass the username and password into the body of our post request. And the backend take care of authentication of the user with this username and password, and if the user is existed and the password is correct, then it returns a user object along with a JWT access token, which we can use it later in our request to the backend. So if the user is not existed or the password is incorrect, the backend side doesn't send us a user object, so we just return null, which means that the username and password is incorrect and the user is not authenticated. And if you're not familiar with the Next-Auth package and how it works, I highly recommend you to watch my previous video, which is about the configurations and how to authenticate a user with username and password. So in this video, we're not going to cover the basics of the Next-Auth. We'll just cover the how to authorize a user based on its role, which is whether it's admin or not. So before we start, let me show you when we send a post request to this backend API, how it responds to us. So I open up the Insomnia, which is just like the Postman. And here, if I send a post request to this localhost 8000/auth/login with this body, username admin and password 123, if I send this, you can see the backend sends us a user object along with the access token. The user object contains the username, its phone name, and also its role, which is very important for us in this video. Now if I logged in with another user, user1 for example, and send the request, you can see the user1, a normal user, and its role is user now, not the admin. So based on this role, we can authorize our users with specific action that they want to do. And if our user has a role property, and also an access token, we have to kind of modify the user type inside the NextAuth in a way that it contains the role and access token for us. So I go back to the VS Code, and the first thing I want to do this is to create a folder named Types. And inside this Types folder, I'm going to create a file named interfaces.ts, and here I'm going to define an interface for our user object. So the user has a name, has a role, a username, and also an access token. The name of the user must be string or null or undefined. This is very important. If you don't define the type of name of the user like this, you can get an error later in this video. So I've saved this, and here in the Types folder, I'm going to create another file called Next-Auth .e.ts. The name of this file must be exact the same, and it must be inside the Types folder. And in this file, we're going to define the shape of our session object. So the first thing I'm going to do is to declare a module called NextAuth, and we put the NextAuth inside the quotation marks. Then in this module, we're going to define an interface called session, and the session object must have a user object, which is the type of our user, which comes from the interfaces file, not the user that comes from the NextAuth. So in this way, we override the shape of our session object in a way that now it has a user object with the type of our user interface we have just defined in the interfaces file. So let's save this and go to the NextAuth configuration file inside the pages folder, and in this file, after the providers list, we're going to define an object called callbacks. And in this object, we're going to define two functions, JWT function and session function. So I'm going to say async, because this is an async function, JWT, and then from the parameter of this JWT function, we're going to destructure the token and also the user, and then return an object that contains the properties of both token and also the user. So I'm going to spread the token here and also spread the user. So in this way, we're going to merge the user object and token object into one object and then return it to the token. So the second function that I'm going to define here is the session. So I'm going to say async session, and from the parameter of this session, we're going to destructure the session, token, and also the user. And then we set the session.user to the token object that we returned here from the JWT function. So the type of this user here inside this session is the user interface that we have defined in the interfaces file. So after that, we're going to return this session, and that's it. So after calling the useSession function, we retrieve an object, a session object that contains a user that have these properties. So yeah, I think it's done with the NextAuth configuration file, and now let's go for the middleware function. So I open up the middleware.ts file here, and this file has two lines of code that we have added in the previous video. The first line checks if the user is logged in. If the user is not logged in, it redirects the user to the login page. And the second line tells that run the middleware for these routes in our application. So this middleware is run for every route that starts with the admin or user in our application. So these two lines of code do the authentication for us, but not the authorization. So to include the authorization, we have to remove this line of code and then export a function which called withAuth, and that function is come from the NextAuth package. So I'm going to say export default withAuth and then import it from the NextAuth/middleware. This function takes two parameters. The first one is the middleware and the second one is the configuration object. So we're going to define our middleware inside it. So I'm going to say function middleware. And this middleware takes a rec, which stands for request, and then after that function we have an object that contains the callbacks, and this callback contains a authorized function, and from the parameter of this authorized function we're going to destructure the token, and then this authorize function returns a boolean. If the boolean is true, the middleware allows the user to go ahead to do what he wants to do. But if the return value of this authorize function is false, the middleware redirects the user to the login page. So here we're going to say that if the token exists, then the user is authenticated, and then it doesn't need to redirect the user to the login page. So here we transform the token object to the boolean. If the token exists, we return true, and if the token is undefined, we return false from the authorize function. So again, if the authorize function returns false, the middleware function redirects the user to the login page that we have specified in the Next.Auth configuration file. But if the authorize function returns true, the middleware function allows the user to go ahead and do whatever he wants to do. So this authorize function is kind of the authentication check for if the user is logged in or not. So what about the authorization? We implement the authorization inside the middleware function, which we're going to define here. So here we say that if the rec.nextURL.pathname.starts with /admin and rec.nextauth.token.role isn't equal to admin, then return next response, which comes from the next/server dot rewrite a new URL which contains the /auth/login, and then set a message parameters for it. I'm going to say message equals to you are not authorized, and then rec.url. Essentially, we say that if the route starts with the admin and the role of the user is not admin, then redirect the user to the /auth/login and set a message parameter that says you are not authorized, and that's it. So here we can set another option. We can just copy and paste this. So we say that if the URL starts with the user and then the role of the user is not user, then again redirect user to /auth/login with a custom message that you are not logged in. And that's it for the authorization part. It's that simple. We just have to check if our URL or address of our page start with the admin, and if so, check if the role of our user is the proper one. And if it's not, then redirect the user to the login page. And after all, we want to run this middleware for these routes in our application, just as before. So that's it for the authorization part. Okay, let me now run our server and open up my browser. If I click on the user panel, because I'm not logged in, I'm headed to the login page. And if I log in with the user one, hit the login button. Again, if I click on the user panel, now I can access to the user panel. But if I click on the admin panel, because I'm not authorized, I'm not the admin user, I headed to the login page. So essentially, this line of code is now running. So if I log in with the admin, now I can access the admin panel. So again, if I sign out and want to go to the user panel, you can see that I'm headed to the login page. So the next thing I want to do in this application is to take care of writing this custom message above the login page. So here I go back to the VS Code and go to the app/auth/login page, and here I want to define a interface for the shape of the props for the login page. So I'm going to say interface iProps and then search params, which is a object with its keys are string and the values are string or a list of string or undefined. So here we destructure the search params from the props of the login page, and then here in the JSX I'm going to say if the search params.message is existed, then render a parameter for us which contains the search params.message. if you want to know from where this message comes in, go to the middleware, and here you can see that we set a query for this login URL with the name of message. So I go back to the login page and say if the search params.message is existed, then render a parameter with this search params.message. So this how it works in the Next.js version 13. And in this way you can extract the query prompts from the props of a page. And if I save this and go to the browser and log in with the normal user, go to the user panel, it's okay. But if I go to the admin panel, we can see the "you are not authorized" message here in the login page. So in this way we can send a custom message from the middleware into the login page. The last thing I want to do in this video is to give you a practical example of how we can include our access token inside the HTTP requests that are being sent to the backend. So the access token I'm talking about is this access token that we have retrieved from our backend API. And here I have another backend API, which is /user and then the name of our user. This API gives the information about the user that we are sending its username as a param into this backend API. So if I go ahead and send this GET request, the response is an unauthorized 401 message that says I'm not authorized to call this API. So in order to call this API, we have to include this access token inside our request to this /user/username API. So let's do it in action. This is the scenario. We have a button here, and when we click on it, it retrieves the user information from the backend API that we just talked about. And it doesn't get a 401 unauthorized message because it includes the access token inside the HTTP request that is being sent to the backend API. So let's implement this in action. So I switch back again into the VS Code and go to the app folder /admin/panel and open the page.tsx file. And the first thing I want to do is to retrieve the session from the use session and then define a state that contains our user data, which its type is the user interface that we have defined in the beginning of this video. So in order to use state in this page, we have to mark this page with the use client annotation. And then we are going to define a function called fetch user profile. So I'm going to say const fetch user profile, and this is a async function. And here we're going to say const res equal to await fetch API, and then grab the address of this backend API from Insomnia, then paste it here, and here inside the name of the user use a template literal which says that session.user.username. Then we're going to say the method of this request is get, and then we set the headers, which says its content type is application/JSON, and the most important one is here. We're going to say that authorization and set it to a string which starts with bearer. This is very important. You have to exactly say the bearer in the beginning of your string, and then put the access token that we store in our session. So I'm going to say session. The session again is come from the use session from NextAuth. So I'm going to say session user and then access token. So in this way, we include the access token that we retrieve from the backend login API inside this fetch request to the /user/username API, again from the backend. So the next thing, we're going to say const data equals to await res.json, and then set the user data from the data that we retrieved from this backend API. And here in the JSX, we're going to add a button here which calls this fetch user profile. So let's import the button, and then render the user data into the screen. So let's save this and go to the browser. And if I click on the user profile, you can see that we are getting the right information from that backend API. So again, if I go back to the VS Code and here in the authorization, slightly distort this access token, or better starter, save this and open up my console, and again send the request. You can see that we get a 401 unauthorized response from this backend API. Again, if I go back to the VS Code and fix this bearer token, now if I click this, you can see that the information properly without any error. And yeah, we have successfully implemented the authorization with NextAuth in Next.js version 13. And also we got the idea of how we can store our backend access tokens inside the NextAuth session and how to include them inside the requests that are being sent into the backend APIs. So till the next video, bye bye.